Welcome to American Romanticism. No, it is not about falling in love. This is Dr. Catherine Abernathy, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of what the characteristics of Romanticism are. Before we go through this overview, you may want to print out the 10 bullet point handout on Romanticism that is in the module that we're covering right now. It's under handouts. It follows basically the same order as this presentation, and it will provide a foundation for the notes that you should be taking by hand as you watch this. This is a longer presentation than the normal ones that we will do, but you need it before you get into the works of Romanticism that you will be reading all the way through Melville, Whitman, Dickinson. It will reference several works that you've not read yet, but you can come back to this presentation and your notes for insights into the works as we get to them. It'll help you, though, to know what you're looking for as you're reading the works. So first, what is American Romanticism? What is romantic literature? Not Harlequin romances. First, the first characteristic that we might think about in romantic literature is faith in the goodness of individuals. You should also keep in mind that not every romantic author is going to use every trait of romanticism. These traits are simply things that critics have come along and said, oh, this tends to be in a work or not. But usually in romanticism, you will find that individuals are seen as fundamentally good or having or as being potentially good. They're usually good by nature. They have good intentions. They're trying to do the right thing. But if you have already started reading Charles Brockden Brown's Wieland, or if you're familiar with Nathaniel Hawthorne's novels and short stories, you might be saying, wait, that doesn't sound right. You want to think about, does the author present characters who are good by nature or potentially good by nature? Then we also have a tendency toward optimism. If people are generally good by nature or have a good inclination, the transcendentalists, who were part of the Romantic movement, would also be seeking to perfect the self. If you remember, Louisa May Alcott wrote Little Women, and perhaps some of you have seen Little Women, the movie. You may remember that toward the end of the movie, Jo talks about being a transcendentalist, and she says that because of this, they're trying to make themselves better. They don't drink alcohol. They don't drink caffeine. They study. They get together in community to study and grow spiritually. They are attempting to make themselves better. There's the search to perfect the self. Louisa May Alcott, by the way, was the daughter of Bronson Alcott, who they all lived in Concord, Massachusetts, in a neighborhood close to Ralph Waldo Emerson. You will be reading Emerson, also close to Nathaniel Hawthorne. You will be reading some of his work, and then Henry David Thoreau, that we are not reading this time, but they all lived close together, and many of them were transcendentalists. So Louisa May Alcott is one that you might know of through popular literature. Also, if the individual is seeking to perfect himself and is seeking the good of others, there's hope in democracy and equality as the individual is celebrated. If people are tending to be good by nature, trying to make themselves better, trying to better their community, they'll make good choices in a democracy and can set up a good government that way. A caution here, though. Emerson and Charles Brockden Brown may not be saying the same thing when they talk about faith in human reason and the senses. Human reason is more something like intuition for the Romantic. Reason is not logic. Reason, for the purposes of this course, reason is more like intuition. So when Emerson talks about reason, he's talking about intuition. And none of the Romantics are going to be terribly fond of relying wholly on the five senses, sight, taste, that sort of thing. Instead, looking at nature and the individual, they are very inclined toward nature, and the individual makes use of nature. Nature can be a source of inspiration. When we get to Emerson, you'll be reading a work called Nature. In this work, we see that nature should inspire the individual, inspire the viewer to see a higher order, to see God or the Great Spirit or the oversoul of the world, whatever that greater force is that created everything, created the cosmos. We should see the creator in the creation. So nature is a source of inspiration for us. Also, for the Romantic, nature is a source of refuge. Here you see a little cabin in the woods next to Walden Pond. Henry David Thoreau's the one who went to Walden. He says, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, to discover that I had not lived." He did want to simplify. He encouraged us to simplify our lives. He built a little cabin in the woods, went off and lived there for a time, and sought refuge from the distractions of the world and sought inspiration at Walden Pond. This is also in Concord, Massachusetts. Also, focusing on the individual, the Romantics saw the individual's vision as the thing that was important. Any individual, common man, poor person, rich person, male, female, it didn't matter, old, young. It was not one social rank or social status. It didn't matter who you were to the Romantics. It just mattered that you were encouraged to seek out your own vision. Each student should seek his or her own ideas and thoughts. You can see this in Emerson's The American Scholar. He says, hey, Aristotle, Shakespeare, all the great thinkers of the past were just people too, just like you and I are people, so we can think on our own and think independently. Each individual should be self-reliant. Thoreau also seeks solitude and simplicity for inspiration. He goes off looking for truth, just communing with nature. The individual and nature together should be enough. We should be able to find out what we need to know. Finally, individual feelings are what are important, not reason in terms of logic. Spontaneity, that's great. Imagination, that's great. Emotion, great. We're not focusing on expectations because you grew up in a particular part of town or your last name was something. You don't have to become whatever that implies. Expectations are out, spontaneity is in. Tradition is out and imagination is in. Tradition, just because your parents did something the way they did, you didn't have to go to the same church or build your house the same way. You don't have to follow those traditions. Similarly, rational logic is replaced more by intuition and emotion. Finally, a transcendent reality is also part of the Romantic vision. There will be another presentation on transcendentalism where we'll go into transcendentalism itself as a movement. This is not like modern transcendentalism. This is more what's going on in Concord with, as I said, Emerson and Bronson Alcott and that group. But the transcendent reality that they're talking about is some reality, God, a spirit, whatever that is higher than the individual. And the Romantics sought to find or connect with this transcendent reality largely through the sublime. Sublime does not mean what many people think it means today. You don't want a sublime wedding. A sublime day is not good for a picnic because it is characterized by nobility and grandeur, but not necessarily a happy, sunny one. The effect is a momentary suspension of rational activity. Lots of words real fast there. To slow this down and to give you a sense of what that means, think of Job meeting God in the whirlwind. There is an encounter with a higher power in the sublime. There is something grand and noble about it. It points out how small we are as human beings and how huge some transcendent force is. When we say there is a momentary suspension of rational activity, think about how you would feel if you suddenly encountered God in person. I mean, it would be overwhelming, and you would not be thinking about things like, gee, I think he's this tall, and he weighs this much, and his eyes are this color. You wouldn't be thinking those things. Actually, you would not be thinking rationally. You would just experience without reason. So there is your rational capacity is just sort of suspended. It's just put on hold and you just experience. The setting then for the sublime would be mountains, castles, ruins, some big chasm somewhere, a hurricane or something like that, something big and powerful. If you want to know more about this, there's a short video on this in this module also on the sublime. It's just a short video that you could get more insight into the sublime. It's very important, especially to people like Emerson. Transcendentalism, very briefly. Transcendentalists wanted to get close to nature. Emerson, there you go. Dignity of work. Louisa May Alcott was a writer early on. She celebrated the work of all people. Intellectual community. The Transcendentalists in Concord would get together and talk. Self-reliance. Even though you have a community, you are responsible for your own thoughts. There's also that break from tradition and an inclination toward democracy that we were talking about before. Also, Transcendentalism puts an emphasis on spiritual living and self-perfection that we mentioned before. It's not about getting more stuff. It's not material living. It's not about how much money you make, but how you work to perfect your soul. Man's relationship with God is important, but it is a personal matter. It is not about going to church or participating in organized religion. This also is seen in Emerson, in his belief in the essential divinity of man. Man participates in the divine, in God. We are part of God. And then finally, we come to know what we know through intuition more than through our senses and empirical knowledge. So it's not how much, we're not worried about how much something weighs or how big it is or what it looks like, feels like, sounds like, those sorts of things. Not through the senses, but through intuition. And that is a very quick overview of Romanticism. Again, it's not about falling in love. Please do not look at the works and say that they are or are not romantic literature because someone does or does not fall in love in the story. It's all about these other characteristics that we see in Romanticism and Transcendentalism. You would need to go ahead and just the main thing is be reading, and feel free to come back to this Prezi or go back and look at your notes that are summarized on those 10 bullet points for more information.